I want to talk about a poet who's been dear to me, especially the last few years, who just passed away last month. I found out about it on Facebook, and it kind of hit me hard. And so I want to talk about Jane Greer. Jane Greer was an American poet, lifelong Roman Catholic, who lived most of her life in South Dakota. She went to a Catholic college there in South Dakota. On a broad trip in college, she met a man named Jim. They would fall in love and get married. And they lived most of their lives in South Dakota, serving the church, caring for the homeless, working with Special Olympics athletes, and oh yeah, inventing the New Formalist movement. Now, we've talked about New Formalism on this channel before, but let me refresh your memory. In the late 20th century, especially the mid to late 80s, poets were getting tired of the sort of T.S. Eliot, Allen Ginsberg, Sylvia Plath style poetry that came to dominate the mid-century. Very little rhyme and meter, lots of talking about one's neuroses and troubles and traumas. Poets started to say, hey, what about a sonnet? What about a ballad? What about writing about things that aren't just what we tell our therapist? What if we wrote about history? What if we wrote about myth? Of course, history and myth were there. Go read, say, The Colossus by Sylvia Plath. But these poets began to long for a return to the formal traditions of the past. And in the early 80s, Jane Greer, coming out of college, informed by the Catholic literary tradition, she not only started writing formalist poetry, but she founded a poetry journal called Plains Poetry Journal, which was dedicated to formalist poetry. This caught on. Another writer named Annie Finch would come along a few years later and edit a collection called A Formal Feeling Comes, which was formalist poems by American women. Jane Greer's poetry would be featured in A Formal Feeling Comes, along with a short manifesto that Greer wrote calling for a return to form. Not saying, if you don't write in form, you're the worst, or, I only respect people who write in form, but basically an invitation to you could write in form too, and that could be good. And it caught on. A generation of poets were inspired by people like Annie Finch and Jane Greer to write formalist poetry. We've talked about some of those poets on this podcast. Dana Gioia is one of now the elder statesmen of formalist poetry. When I started writing poetry in the 20-aughts, became interested in New Formalism, partly because of the work of people like Dana Gioia and others. It wasn't until around 2020 that I became familiar with Jane Greer. The editor of Dappled Things Journal, Katie Carl, asked me to review this book, Love Like a Conflagration. And I read it, and as I read it, I realized, Jane Greer is the reason I have the poetic sensibilities and I treasure the poetics that I do, because I saw that Jane Greer influenced Annie Finch. Annie Finch was influential to me when I was in grad school. I looked at A Formal Feeling Comes, and one of my professors, Janine Hathaway, who is not strictly a formalist poet, but likes formalist poetry, she pointed me in the direction of Finch and A Formal Feeling Comes and the other new formalists. And so I realized, Jane is this sort of wellspring from which new formalism flows. Now, Jane Greer published a book in the 80s called Bathsheba on the Third Day. And I have this sort of vintage first edition of it that I paid. I don't remember what I paid online, but it was a lot. And if you can see, try and get it in focus, it's got this great sort of red tab on the cover. And this was printed in a limited edition. I think there were only 300 printed. It's got wonderful deckled edge pages. It says "For Jim," her husband. It was published by the Cummington Press in 1986 in Omaha, Nebraska. It's got this lovely this lovely front piece that I believe it's either an etching or an intaglio print. Very lovely. And just really a really well put together collection. I want to read you a couple Jane Greer poems, both from Love Like a Conflagration, which was her collection that came out in 2020, and Bathsheba on the Third Day. It's interesting, if you think 1986 to 2020, that's a long time, isn't it? What was she doing? Well, Bathsheba on the Third Day was sort of this production of someone who was working as a teacher, who worked with prison ministries, who worked with nuns, who was also editing a poetry journal. And so Jane Greer was busy. She published Bathsheba on the Third Day in 1986 and really didn't get around to publishing another collection until 2020. Now, Jane talks about how in 2018 she kind of had this resurgence of just kind of the muse returning. She was sitting there in a square in New Orleans and said, all of a sudden I felt like I could write again. Now, I don't know when it was that Greer stopped writing. It probably somewhere in the 90s. I think in 1993 she stops editing the Plains Poetry Journal. She had edited it for 12 years since 1981. And so something of a hiatus took place, which, is not uncommon in writing. But this 2018 resurgence led to Love Like a Conflagration, which also collects within it Bathsheba on the Third Day, because this has long been out of print. And then it was followed up in 2022 by The World as We Know It Is Falling Away, which was her final published collection. Now, I've heard that Greer actually has a collection that she was preparing before her death. And so I'm looking forward to that coming out. And yet what we have is really lovely. So I want to share a few poems with you. One of the things that Greer is really great at is lush, dense description of foliage, of animals. Here is a poem called Her Green Desire. Her green desire is thorn and thicket, twisted root, tangle of shoot and tendril, hot and wet, everything over much. A wet green paradise through which winds whitely, although she cannot hear it, watery-mouthed, a red-eyed ferret. Now, we could read this and just kind of exult in the sounds, and yet formally, this is following a pretty regular structure. The first line is thorn and thicket, twisted root, and then second line, tangle of shoot and tendril, hot and wet, everything over much. So that's 3 lines of 8 syllables each, and we have root, hot, and much. Root and hot are kind of slant rhymes. Much doesn't rhyme with either of those, but if we then go down to the second stanza, which is 3 more lines, a wet green paradise through which winds whitely, though she cannot hear it, watery mouth, a red-eyed ferret. So this is 8 syllables, 9 syllables, 9 syllables. That which now creates a slant rhyme and links up to the much, the third line of the first stanza, and then hear it and ferret almost precisely rhyme with each other. Not quite. It's interesting, why 9 syllables? The first 4 lines are 8. Well, root, hot, much, and which are all 8th stressed syllables. And hear it and ferret are syllables 8 and 9 in each line, and both of them have a stressed unstressed or a trochaic rhythm. So actually you do have a stressed 8th syllable that she just adds on an unstressed 9th syllable. A poet with an ear like Greer, and Greer's ear for rhythm and rhyme was one of the best in our late age. She can hear that hear it and ferret are going to work even though they give us an extra syllable. I want to read to you one of her early sonnets that's just quite lovely. This is called Heart Wounding Woods, and this is from Bathsheba on the third day. Do you recall the late afternoon light, oblique in October woods, the slanting gold carelessly cast, mottling the secret ground? The smoke of dreams, surrendered or attained, hung in the air, and loss and discontent grew in the still green dappled undergrowth. Do you remember, deep in heart-wounding woods, pungent longing in the pungent leaves, as you sat in stippled shade with half-closed eyes, and there moved across your face and toward the night the last patch of irretrievable light? The rhyme scheme isn't regular, but we start with light at the end of the first line, and we end with light at the end of the 11th line, and you have a couplet between toward the night and irretrievable light in the last two lines, and it's really wonderfully done. I want to read you a funnier poem. This is actually the title poem of Bathsheba on the third day. This is it's fun. Bathsheba on the third day. Hot, hot, hot is all those spooky crows can think to say. We ought to have some people over, take in a funny show, redecorate this tent. Aren't you listening, lover? We'll just have to invent our own fun, take a course, maybe, in the fall, and then, oh, please, babe, not again. We never talk anymore. It's a short dramatic monologue. It's Bathsheba. What third day? I assume it's on the third day of Bathsheba and David and their love affair, famously from the book of Samuel. The King David sees Bathsheba bathing on the roof. She's not married to David. She's married to someone else. David conveniently sends her husband away to die in battle, and then they have a very famous love affair from which King Solomon famously is born. But Greer has this wonderful kind of wry sense of humor and kind of married banter that she'll slip into, and it's great that, you know, Bathsheba is saying, hey, like, should we have people over? We should watch a show, maybe redecorate. I like this. Maybe take a course in the fall. This is a bit of a 20th, 21st century viewpoint. But then, of course, in the last couple, we find out David only has his mind on one thing. Oh, please, babe, not again. We never talk anymore. Of course, David, like a man, is not thinking about anything but the love affair that they're carrying on. Greer can be read as a poet with a fierce feminist sensibility. As a Roman Catholic, she had very strong views on men's and women's roles, and yet the views would probably surprise most people who maybe think they know what a conservative Roman Catholic would think. Greer was a poet of wit, of intelligence, of formal rigor, and she's a poet that I hope we're going to be talking about for a long time.